Alright guys, my name is MetaGoblin and today we're going to be making a tier list for all of the classes in Classic TBC. I will go through every single specialization, and as you can see the tier list is only S to D. You don't really need loads of different tier lists for the classes in TBC because there isn't that much of a significant divide between all of the specs. Honestly guys, the thing that it mostly boils down to, as you can see in the notes on the tier lists, is which classes are going to be stacked, which you will probably not bring more than 2 to a raid, which classes you'll only bring 1 to a raid, which classes you're going to put into a flex group, and then some very niche specs at the bottom. But anyway guys, if you end up liking this video, please do consider subscribing because that really helps out, and there's more content on TBC coming very soon, pretty much 5 uploads a week, that's what I'm aiming for anyway. But anyway, let's jump in. I should also clarify that we are purely talking about raid performance in this tier list. We're not really talking about dungeons or PvP. I'll make separate tier lists for that element of the game. So first of all, we have Balance, Boomkin, Moonkin spec, whatever you want to call it. Has a very comfortable spot in tier B. You'd never really see more than 2 Boomkins in one raid group, talking a 25-man raid group. They provide a really significantly big 5% spell crit boost for the casters. They also provide hit chance for the melee group. They provide innovate for the healers, and obviously they also have combat res, so a very good strong support class overall. So next we have Bear Druid. I'm going to put honestly all the tank specs in tier A because I honestly think that all the tank specs are fairly well balanced. Bear tank, great big meaty main tank. They're also very useful because there's a certain number of situations in TBC where you actually only need 1 tank for the boss, and then you can get your Feral Druid to just quickly switch into cat form and Bob's your uncle who's doing fairly decent DPS, whereas warriors and paladins don't really have that luxury as much, so obviously a great tank to bring to a raid. Next we have Cat Druid, again has another comfortable spot in tier B. Great support primarily for melee by increasing their crit by 5%. And also a little bit of cheeky off healing of everything else I mentioned before, like innovate and combat res. Next we have a Resto Druid. I would, if there was such thing as a tier like between tier A and tier B, this is probably where I'd put the Resto Druid, to be honest. The only reason why I'm putting it in tier B is simply because the other healers provide a little bit more support than a Resto Druid. Let's move on to the Beast Mastery Hunter. So Beast Mastery goes straight into tier S. You probably want at least 3 for your raid group, maybe even more, because they provide such a ridiculous amount of DPS. They are considered the best. Is between Beast Mastery Hunter and Destruction Warlock of who is the top dog DPS in TBC. So you probably see, you know, 3 hunters in a 25-man raid group. Their DPS is just ridiculous, mainly because of the Beast Lord set, which provides you with extra arm penetration essentially whenever you use kill command, and it just boosts their damage by a ridiculous amount, and it's only pre-raid loot as well. So yeah, Beast Mastery always strong start to finish of TBC. Next we have Marksman Hunter. Not really a lot to say about Marksman Hunter really, it's only very a niche spec. People are probably only going to spec it if they really get bored of Beast Mastery Hunter because it's nowhere near as strong as Beast Mastery Hunter. Then we have Survival Hunter. You probably will only want to bring 1 to a raid for a particular debuff that they provide that will boost the DPS of all the Beast Mastery Hunters. So some people like to min-max a Survival Hunter into their setup for that purpose. And obviously it's a little bit more interesting to play than Beast Mastery because you are just going to be spamming a 1-button macro in Beast Mastery spec, so if you're a bit bored of Beast Mastery you can go Survival to provide a really useful debuff for your raid. You'll obviously take a hit to your DPS, but you will more than make up for it with that debuff. Next we have Arcane Mage. I may as well just put all the Mage specs in tier A. Actually I'll talk about Frost a little bit later. So Arcane becomes a really strong DPS spec when you have particular gear equipped, primarily the tier 5 set bonus that boosts the damage of Arcane Blast. Pretty straightforward. So when you have that gear equipped, you're going to be doing a lot of damage in Arcane, but most of the other time you are going to be spec'd into Fire spec, and then sometimes people spec into Frost spec at the beginning of Karazhan, but again, I think Frost is going to be more of a niche spec when it comes to raiding, because most of the time in TBC, you know, Arcane and Fire are totally dominant over Frost spec. But honestly, if TBC is launching with fresh servers where people don't have classic WoW gear equipped, speccing into Frost spec, when you just go into Karazhan, you probably actually do more damage with Arcane and Fire, just simply by the fact that you can use Icy Veins into a Cold Snap and benefit from that cooldown twice in one raid fight. You also have the Water Elemental too, which overall will probably just slightly get ahead of the other specs. If the Fire Mage you're up against has barely any spell crit chance, but again it is more of a niche spec for the entirety of TBC. Next we have the Holy Paladin, which I'm going to put in tier A. This does not necessarily mean you will always see 2 Holy Paladins in a raid, because ideally you want to get a mixture of healers in your raid group, but Holy Paladin, you really cannot fault a Holy Paladin. They are ridiculously strong healers and obviously provide very useful buffs for the entire raid. Ideally you want at least 3 Paladins within your raid group to provide at least every single useful buff that a particular class can benefit from. Some classes can actually benefit from 4 buffs, but most classes are pretty solid with about 3 of the different Paladin buffs. And obviously they also provide really useful utility like Lay of Hands, which doesn't just provide a fat heal, can also increase the armour of the tank. Got Blessing of Protection to protect healers because it totally drops their aggro. But you also have things like Turn Evil, which can be very useful on certain boss fights. So yeah, overall a really strong healer. But again, the reason why it's not in tier B like the rest of the Druid is simply because they provide a little bit more support and utility than a Resto Druid. Next we have Protection Paladin. I'm going to put this in A tier, but honestly I would put it in S tier, but I don't want to get people to get frustrated with me. I have a lot of bias when it comes to Protection Paladin because it's one of my favourite specs of all time. They are a ridiculously... Probably I would argue that they're the best all-round tank in TBC, simply by the fact that they can do so much AoE threat when it comes to, you know, doing dungeons and stuff like that, but we are primarily talking about raids right now. So Protection Paladin, with Holy Shield up, they can maintain 100% avoidance, well 102.4 whatever percent avoidance to totally mitigate crushing blows, whereas a warrior can actually struggle with that with shield block. They also have extremely good stamina scaling because they have 2 talents that increase their stamina by a certain percentage, where obviously as you get more and more gear, more stamina gems, that just magnitudes over. That's not even a word, but I think you know what I mean. We also generate a massive amount of threat on undead and demon targets, which are quite in high abundance in TBC, primarily because of abilities like Exorcism. So yeah, they're just overall a really strong tank, and like I said before, I would argue that they're the best all-round tank simply because they are so useful for doing dungeons and allow mages and warlocks to really go fat with their AoE DPS, whereas warriors and feral druids really cannot provide that much amount of AoE threat compared to a Protection Paladin, so you're normally going to get a much slower dungeon run with a warrior or a feral. But anyway, moving on to Retribution. So Retribution is going to have a comfortable spot in tier B. Again, it's a very useful support spec, but you really don't want more than one, because you basically bring in a Retribution Paladin to refresh judgment debuffs on the boss, like Judgment of Wisdom and Judgment of Light, and then Judgment of the Crusader. So Seal of Wisdom provides AoE mana regeneration for the entire raid, which is really strong. Seal of Light provides the same but healing, and then we also have Seal of the Crusader, which gives everyone in the raid, every DPS, casters and melee, an extra 3% crit, which is really strong. So because of how the ability called Crusader Strike works, it basically refreshes every single judgment debuff on the target, so the Holy Paladin doesn't have to go into melee range, well close to melee range, I think it's like 8 yards, to keep refreshing it. He can just sit back and let the Retribution Paladin refresh everything for him. So you have all those 3 really powerful, very useful debuffs just rolling on the boss constantly when you have a Retribution Paladin in the group. And then obviously we've talked about everything else that a Paladin provides, like for instance the buffs and everything like that, so let's move on. So now we have Discipline Priest. Very niche spec, it will have, you know, it's not going to be the main healing spec for when it comes to TBC raiding, but from time to time you may see a Discipline Priest spec for pain suppression, but that will only really happen if you're struggling with a particular fight on like a progression fight. It depends how difficult classic TBC raiding is actually going to be, because pain suppression is like a little mini shield wall and can be very useful on particular fights that are very difficult for the main tank. So you may see one priest now and again go deep into discipline, but again it's a rare niche spec. Next we have Holy. That's going to go straight into tier A. If we are evaluating the healers purely on healing, then obviously a Holy Priest is always going to be the best. They have great single target tank healing, AoE healing, and they also provide an amazing amount of support and utility for the raid in the form of things like Fear Ward, Such things like stamina buff, spirit buff, and debuffing, everything that is always great about bringing a Holy Priest. Next we have the Shadow Priest, which is going to get a comfortable spot in tier A. This does not necessarily mean that every single raid is going to be stacking 2. Firstly, because Shadow Priests are quite rare, not many people play them, so it's actually quite difficult to get 2 in your 25-man raid group. But if you look at actually some of the world first Black Temple runs back in the day, some groups did actually roll with 2 Shadow Priests, and I'm going to tell you why Shadow Priest is so good. They're definitely not going to provide the best DPS in a raid. They probably provide, honestly, the worst DPS, you know, next to a Retribution Paladin. But all of their damage is converted into an extremely high amount of mana regeneration for the entire group, which will obviously in turn provide a lot of extra DPS brought from the caster DPS, or simply a lot of survivability by regenerating all the healer's mana. We also have very powerful debuffs like Shadow Weaving and Misery. First of all, Misery provides an extra flat spell damage to the target, so it benefits mages and warlocks, but on top of that you also have Shadow Weaving, which specifically increases the shadow damage dealt to the target by 15%. You're probably going to have 3 warlocks in your group spamming Shadow Bolt, so that'll be a total increase of 45% damage from the warlocks, which is pretty huge. So overall I would consider the Shadow Priest to be the strongest support DPS class, very close behind the Shaman probably. You can argue about that in the comment section below. So let's move on to Rogue. So I'm presuming this is combat spec. So combat spec is going to be in the flex group. You do need melee DPS when it comes to TBC raiding, but in all honesty they are just quite far behind the range DPS, probably like 200 to 300 DPS on average behind all the other DPS. So guilds that min-max quite a lot, which is honestly not really going to be that necessary in TBC. Then you will probably see rogues more likely to be in a flex group, or you know, only one brought to a raid. This just means that once a month you probably have to pug a raid. It's not that much of a huge issue. Melee DPS are obviously still very useful for a TBC raiding environment because certain bosses simply require melee DPS for them to actually be defeated. Moving on. And by the way, when I'm talking about combat, I am talking combat swords and daggers. Next we have the assassination spec. So this is basically a niche spec, and so is Double T. What it's called is a mutilate rogue. You see them from time to time, but we just don't provide as much DPS as a combat rogue, so really people only spec into Double T and assassination for the fun of it, or if they're also doing PvP and don't want to keep respecing over time to save a little bit of money. You can still jump into a raid and do decent DPS, but you're not going to do much DPS as combat spec. Next we have the Elemental Shaman. Going to put them straight into S tier. So the main reason why a Shaman is so high in this tier list is because of Bloodlust and Heroism, which is a ridiculous DPS boost in the TBC, especially as it can be reapplied without a debuff, so you can just keep applying it over and over again depending on how many Shamans you have. It will only affect one party, but a lot of the time that's all you need. Overall you will get a much bigger benefit out of Heroism than you ever will do in, you know, Wrath of the Lich King and later expansions. It simply buffs the DPS of Warlocks and Hunters so much, and it's why Shamans are very likely to be stacked quite high in a raid group. You know, you at least want a good 3 Shamans, maybe 2 Resto, 1 Elemental and 1 Enhancement probably brought to a raid. So next we have Enhancement. I'm going to put Enhancement in A tier. This doesn't necessarily mean that 2 are going to be brought to a raid. The only reason why I'm putting them in A tier is they obviously provide the same amount of support as a Elemental Shaman, but they just provide a little bit personal DPS themselves. I should clarify that both Elemental and Enhancement have very strong totems. For instance, Elemental Shaman have Totem of Wrath that increases the hit and crit chance of everyone in the party by 3%. And then you have the Enhancement Shaman, which provides really powerful DPS boosts to the melee DPS through the increased power of Wind Fury Totem, and also they have a little bit of an extra buff called Unleashed Rage, which will also provide a lot of extra DPS for the Hunters. So a lot of people like to throw the Enhancement Shaman into a Hunter group and actually just put the Restoration Shaman in the melee group instead, to give them Wind Fury Totem, and may even spec that Restoration Shaman deeper into the Enhancement tree to pick up that weapon buff talent in the... But anyway, moving on, I'm obviously going to put Restoration into the S tier for the exact same reasons I put in Elemental there. We don't really need to talk about this anymore. Shamans provide a ridiculous amount of support, and the only reason why Enhancement is a little bit lower is because they don't provide as much of their own personal DPS as an Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shamans can actually easily out DPS Warlocks and Mages in the early tiers because they actually do really strong DPS. Next we have the Affliction Warlock. If you're min-maxing, a raid group may bring one Affliction Warlock for all the extra debuffs that they provide. If you speak deep into Affliction, it just slightly buffs a lot of the debuffs that a Warlock provides, like Curse of Elements and things like that. So you may bring one, you may not. You can also, they will also off-spec a little bit into Demonology to get a little bit extra power out of their imp, and then get thrown into the tank group to give them a little bit of extra health with the Blood Pact spell from the imp. So yeah, you probably only bring one to a raid. Some people don't even like to bring one at all, but you know, it's really up to your guild leaders. So anyway, now we have Demonology. This is more of a niche spec. I have heard people argue that Demonology can be, you know, a close contender to Destruction and Affliction, but you know, it remains to be seen, it remains to be proven to me. Apparently Demonology is a really strong DPS spec if you can manage your pet correctly. But overall I think it's going to be much more of a niche spec. It's more of a solo leveling spec. Next we have a Destruction Warlock, straight into tier S. They have a ridiculous amount of DPS like the Beast Mastery Hunter. They're, you know, a close spot for the top DPS of the entire expansion. This is mainly because of the talent improved Shadow Bolt. So whenever a Warlock crits with a Shadow Bolt, it increases the damage of further Shadow Bolts after that. So when you have 3 Warlocks in the group that can all provide that debuff, it basically increases the chance of that debuff occurring to the point where it's pretty much up constantly. And yeah, they just have great synergy with all the other Warlocks. It's why Warlocks are stacked so much in you know, TBC. In my experience though, Warlocks are actually less common than a Beast Mastery Hunter, so it is definitely a good class option in my opinion for TBC, just simply by the fact there's going to be, it's just a rarer class. Anyway, let's move on to the Warrior now. So first of all, we have the Fury Warrior. Very similar story to the Combat Rogue. They simply just do not provide enough personal DPS until the later tiers of TBC rating. The later tiers, yeah, you may see Rogue and Warrior go a little bit further up in the tree to a tier B, because you obviously want to deck out those Rogues and Warriors with Warglaives, and then, you know, they'll obviously have a massive DPS boost running into the Sunwell. And another thing you have to question is, obviously there's a lot of melee DPS gear dropping from raids and caster DPS gear. If you stack loads of caster DPS, it's just going to take so much longer to actually gear people up. So yeah, in the later tiers you are going to see more Rogues and Warriors start to pop up. Next we have the Protection Warrior. I'm going to put these in tier A. Largely considered to be the strongest main tank in TBC because of all of the ridiculously useful cooldowns that they can provide, like Shield Wall, Last Stand, and everything like that. So a really strong, great main tank. And lastly we have the Arms Warrior. So if you're in a min-maxing raid group, you will actually see a lot of people bring one Arms Warrior to a raid group. This is largely to do with the reason that I briefly mentioned before. You want to gear up everyone in your raid group very efficiently. If we have loads of caster DPS, it's just going to take ages to gear them all up. So bringing a little bit of melee DPS helps everyone get geared up very quickly, and overall will increase your raid DPS in the long term. And an Arms Warrior, obviously there's a lot of great big two-handed weapons that are dropping in raids, like Karazhan and the Hammer of Naru, for instance, from Gruul's Lair. And a lot of the time that just gets given to the Retribution Paladin, but if you don't even have a Retribution Paladin, then that big fat two-handed weapon is going to be wasted. So it is good to bring an Arms Warrior, so you don't waste all of that great loot, and when you give an Arms Warrior a big two-handed weapon from a raid, his DPS will go up significantly. And he provides a debuff called Blood Frenzy, which increases the entire raid's DPS by 4%. So that is obviously pretty similar to the Misery debuff, but it's like ×2, because Misery provides an extra 5% spell damage, but this debuff provides all damage, so an increase of 4% is basically twice as useful as Misery. But anyway guys, that's where I'm going to end the video there. Tell me what you think in the comments section, whether you agree with me, disagree with me, whatever. My name is MetaGoblin. Until my next video, ciao.